The real estate agent called me while I was still at the cemetery. My phone was on silent. I had silenced it before the service and had not turned the sound back on because the service had ended and we had moved to the graveside, and there are moments when a phone should remain silent regardless of what is trying to reach you. I felt it vibrate in my coat pocket. I did not look at it. I held my mother's sister's hand while the final words were said, and I looked at the ground where my mother was being placed, and I did not look at my phone. The call was from a number I did not recognize. The voicemail was from a woman named Carol Simmons, who identified herself as a real estate agent and said she was calling regarding a property at 1847 Sycamore Lane, and that she needed to speak with me as soon as possible regarding some documentation that had come to her attention. 1847 Sycamore Lane was my mother's house. The house she had lived in for 26 years. The house I had grown up in. The house that 18 months earlier, when my mother had updated her estate documents during the early stages of her illness, she had transferred into a joint ownership structure with my name alongside hers. A decision her attorney had suggested as a way of ensuring the property transferred cleanly without probate complications. My name was on the deed. My stepfather Raymond's name was not. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you are listening from. My name is Kate Morrison. I am 33 years old. And the conversation Carol Simmons had with me that afternoon, standing in the parking lot of the cemetery where we had just buried my mother, told me something about Raymond that the previous 4 years of watching him had not made quite this clear. My mother had married Raymond when I was 27. She had been alone for 8 years after my father passed. Years I had watched with the particular attention of someone who loves a parent and wants them to be less alone. When Raymond had arrived, I had been genuinely glad. He was attentive and warm and made my mother laugh in ways I had not heard in years. What I had also observed over the 4 years of their marriage was a specific quality in Raymond that I will describe carefully. He was a man who had a very clear sense of what he believed he was owed and a very limited tolerance for documentation that contradicted that belief. This had expressed itself in small conversations. His references to our house from the first year of the marriage, his casual mention of our plans for the property in ways that assumed a stake he had not been given. My mother had managed these moments with the particular patience of a woman who had run her own finances for 8 years and was not confused about what was whose. When her illness began, she had become more deliberate. The deed transfer had been one of those deliberate acts. She had done it with her attorney without drama, and had told me about it in the specific way she told me things that mattered, directly with the documentation in hand sitting at the kitchen table that was still her kitchen table. She had said, "I want to know the house reaches you. Not through a process. Directly." I had the documentation. I had a copy of the deed. I had understood what she meant. Carol Simmons's voicemail said she had been approached about listing a property at 1847 Sycamore Lane. She said the person who had approached her had represented himself as the owner. She said when she had pulled the property records as part of her standard pre-listing process, she had found that the ownership was not as represented. She said she was calling the co-owner of record, which was me, before proceeding further. I called her back from the cemetery parking lot while my mother's friends were still making their way to their cars. She explained what she had told me in the voicemail with more detail. Raymond had contacted her the previous afternoon, the day before the funeral, and had asked her to begin the listing process. He had told her he was the sole owner of the property. She had pulled the title records that morning before the listing was active and had found my name. She said she had not proceeded with the listing. I said thank you. She said she was sorry for my loss. I said I needed to make some calls. I called my attorney from the parking lot before I drove anywhere. Her name was Rebecca Chin. She had helped me review the deed documentation when my mother had made the transfer 18 months earlier and had the full picture. I told her what Carol had told me. She asked 2 questions: whether the deed transfer had been properly recorded with the county, which it had, and whether Raymond had been informed of the transfer at the time it was made. I said I believed my mother had discussed it with him. I said I did not know the specifics of that conversation. Rebecca said, "The recording is what matters legally. His knowledge is relevant to intent but not to the validity of the ownership structure. Your name is on that deed. He cannot list this property without your consent." I asked what she recommended. She said she would send a formal notice to Raymond that day, a letter making clear that the property was jointly owned, that any listing or sale required both owners' consent, and that any attempt to proceed without that consent would be considered unauthorized. She said she would also contact Carol Simmons directly to confirm the ownership situation and to request that she not proceed with any listing arrangement with Raymond. I said yes to both. I sat in the parking lot for a while after the calls. The cemetery was quiet now. Most people had gone to the reception at my aunt's house, which I would need to join shortly, which required me to first put my phone in my bag and become the version of myself that functions at receptions. I took 4 minutes. Then I drove to my aunt's house. Raymond was at the reception. This was expected. He was my mother's husband and the reception was for my mother's people and his presence was appropriate regardless of what he had done the previous afternoon. I had decided, in the 4 minutes I had given myself in the parking lot, that the reception was not the place for any conversation about the house. The reception was for my mother. I said hello to him. He said he was glad I had come. I moved through the room. I saw him watch me twice during the afternoon, with the particular watchfulness of someone who is trying to determine whether you know something. I gave him nothing to read. Rebecca's letter arrived at the house that evening, sent by both email and certified mail. I know this because she texted me to confirm it had been sent. Raymond called me the following morning. He began with the word family, which had become, in my experience, the word people use when the specific merits of their argument are insufficient. He said the house had been his home for 4 years. He said my mother would have wanted him to be comfortable. He said the house was more than a document. I said, Raymond, my mother transferred the deed into joint ownership 18 months ago. Her attorney prepared the document. It was recorded with the county. You were aware of her illness and her estate planning during that period. He said he had not understood what the transfer meant. I said, the transfer means that the house requires both our consents to be listed or sold. You contacted a real estate agent and represented yourself as the sole owner. That is not a misunderstanding. He said he had needed to think about his future. I said, my mother passed yesterday. You contacted a real estate agent the day before her funeral. He was quiet. I said, I am not going to discuss the long-term situation for the property today or this week. What I am going to tell you is that nothing happens with this property without my involvement and my consent, and that Rebecca's office is the appropriate contact for any further conversation about it. He said he had not thought it would come to this. I said, Raymond, my mother put my name on that deed because she knew exactly what she wanted to happen. She was very clear about what she wanted. I ended the call. The long-term situation for the property took 4 months to resolve. Rebecca negotiated with Raymond's attorney. He had retained one, which confirmed that he had understood the situation more clearly than his misunderstanding framing had suggested. The negotiation was methodical. Raymond had a legitimate claim to certain marital assets, which his attorney argued and which Rebecca acknowledged within the appropriate legal framework. The house itself, as a property that had been solely my mother's before the marriage and that she had specifically transferred to me as a deliberate estate planning decision, was not among those assets. Raymond received a settlement, a sum negotiated by the attorneys that addressed his claims to marital property that had accumulated during the 4 years of the marriage. It was fair. I had instructed Rebecca to make it fair because I had no interest in a result that felt punitive to a man who had genuinely loved my mother, even if his first action after her death had told me something about him that changed my understanding of that love. The house is mine now. I moved in 3 months after the settlement. It still smells like her. The specific soap she had used for 30 years. The garden she had tended with the particular patience of someone who understood that things worth having grow slowly. My name was on the deed because she had put it there. She had put it there deliberately 18 months before she needed it to matter. It mattered on the day of her funeral. She had known it would.